Today at the National Press Club, the Special Representative for Australian Agriculture, Sue McCluskey. Ms McCluskey will reflect on her almost 4 years in this inaugural role as an advocate for local agriculture to the world and address the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Sue McCluskey with today's National Press Club address.
Welcome to the National Press Club of Australia on Ngunnawal country for today's Westpac event. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, their elders past and present. I'm Gabrielle Chan. I'm President of the National Rural Press Club and a Guardian columnist. And I'd like to thank the National Press Club and its CEO Maurice Riley for highlighting significant rural issues that affect all Australians, at least those who eat. I'm delighted to moderate this conversation today with Sue McCluskey, a beef cattle farmer from Yass, who happens to be Australia's inaugural Special Representative for Australian Agriculture. Sue has been Director and Board members of many different agricultural bodies, including LiveCorp and the Crawford Fund. She's been a Director for Australian Unity, a Commissioner for the International Agricultural Research Body, ACR, and a Commissioner for the National COVID-19 Advisory Board. In her role as Special Representative, she is empowered to increase Australia's presence in international agriculture and food policy discussions. And while Sue was appointed in 2021 by the previous Morrison government, the role was expanded by the Albanese government to include Australia's commitment to climate action in agricultural production and food systems. Her term comes to an end at the end of this month, and the government has yet to announce whether she will be replaced. So during her term, she engaged with many different leaders and policy issues around issues like sustainability, food security, biosecurity, trade and market access. And today she'll reflect on that role and what she and Australia has learned. You can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust. Our hashtag is NPC. I'd like to welcome Sue McCluskey.
Thank you, everyone. What an absolute privilege it is to be here at the National Rural Press Club, and an absolute privilege it's been to be the inaugural Special Representative for Australian Agriculture. A unique role, a ministerial appointment, but an industry voice. And the uniqueness of it was the fact that I'm a farmer, and I can bring that farmer's voice to the highest level of engagement all around the world. The objectives really were to advocate for Australian agriculture and the rules-based system, but also to step up Australia's global agricultural leadership. And I think we've made a pretty good fist of that in the last 3.5 years. It was very much through the lens of trade and market access, but also a lot of what I had to do was push back on the ideological and prescriptive processes we were seeing come from some parts of the world. As I went through my role over the last 3.5 years, very much there was a focus on sustainability. Sustainability and climate resilience and climate change. And I also saw myself as being the link or the conduit between industry and government. And that was a very important role because when you think of it, government quite often speaks with government and they don't always understand where industry are coming from. Industry can advocate, but they don't always necessarily get the hearings. And I was able to actually pass messages between the two. And sometimes they weren't always the messages that needed to be heard, but they actually had to be said. The other role I think I had, which was particularly important, was to be a concierge. I was one person and I was part-time. And so being able to link people, not just within Australia, but all around the world, was a very important part of this role. So if I reflect back, some of the key highlights I think I'd like to share with you, and there were so many, so it's been hard trying to get just a few. But my first overseas trip was to the UK in 2022, and even though I generally don't get involved in bilateral engagement, because that's very much the responsibility of the Foreign Affairs and Trade portfolio, I was drawn in to really the debate around the UK FTA because we just signed it, but there were concerns in the UK at the time. And so I fronted the House of Commons committee that were making an inquiry into the UK FTA with Australia. And all of the MPs sat there and they danced around the issue for a while and kept asking me about animal welfare. And I kept saying, we have the highest level of commitment to animal welfare. Why do you keep asking this? And then it was a Scottish MP and she said, well, how much lamb are we going to get from mules to sheep? And I said, well, probably none, because we don't mulese our lamb, meat sheep. And she said, oh, tell me more. So I then had a wonderful time explaining to them the difference between meat sheep and wool sheep, why merinos are bred with folds in them to increase production, the fact that we actually get very hot here in summer and we have a lot of flies. And from an animal welfare perspective, it's far better to remove a small piece of skin from the breech of the animal rather than see them die a slow, painful death from fly strike. This was met with, I have to say, a mix of astonishment but appreciation. No one had told them this. And when you think of it, free trade agreements are negotiated government to government, so they don't get the opportunity to have those practical examples. And I think it was the first sign that I saw that this role could really be quite powerful and influential. I did get a personal tour of the Houses of Parliament, and I found out only later that the comments that I'd made were referred to in a report supporting the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement. From that trip, I then went on to Geneva, to the World Trade Organisation, where I presented on maximum residue levels, and I got challenged around this once again. Someone said, how can Australians talk about, MRLs when you use high levels of chemicals and fertilisers? And I said, look, let me respond here, not as a special rep, but as a farmer. On my farm, Australian farmers aren't subsidised. Why would we use any more chemicals or fertilisers than we absolutely have to? Because it costs us money. It was like a no-brainer in the room because people just said, oh, we get it, but you're not subsidised. No, Australian farmers aren't subsidised. Something I've had to continue to talk about all around the world. We've been able to build really strong relationships with the multilateral organisations, in particular the Food and Agriculture Organisation, the FAO in Rome, where we now get regularly invited to go and participate in conferences and events. I've been able to participate in the World Food Forum there. And also I had the opportunity in that first year to go to Latin America. And I think it was with the Latins where I presented in Uruguay to all members of their farming bodies, where I talked about commitment to free and open trade, a commitment to the rules-based system. And the Latins said, this resonates with us. And it's really important that we can work with like minds around the world because collaboration is what it's all about. And it's really important that we can actually continue to collaborate around these important global trading systems. Because of that visit, for the first time, Australia was actually invited to attend a meeting of the Southern Agricultural Ministers at COP, the major climate conference that was held in Dubai. And just as another part that came from that, when I was in Washington for Aim for Climate, I actually got pulled into a meeting with John Kerry. Was never meant to be there, but one of the Latin ag ministers said, you must come. Quite often I found that when I was in country, I was actually treated like an ambassador. And so I very much saw that that was my role, to advocate strongly for Australian agriculture and be an ambassador to carry that message. Certainly the COPs, the climate conferences in Dubai and then last year in Baku have been a wonderful opportunity to showcase Australian agriculture on the world stage, but also make and build that wonderful network that we have globally. And then most recently, I think a real highlight was I got to speak at the Climate and Clean Air Conference in Brazil. And something I've been saying for quite a long time is I generally speak to the converted, and that's probably a lot of you in this room. How do we crack the mainstream? And speaking at this conference was mostly NGOs there, and it took a while to be able to get the message across that agriculture and the environment can and must coexist. But over that week there, the conversations that I was having with people were very much about, yes, we understand the importance of agriculture and how it must be front and centre to climate change. I think one of the things, and I'll start to reflect on perhaps lessons learnt, and that is communication is absolutely critical, and maybe we didn't do that so well in the first year or two. And when I'd go around and talk domestically and I needed to share what I was hearing from overseas, people were quite often saying to me, we don't know this role exists. So we really upped our communications, particularly in social media. And I have to say, last year, I think we were just inundated with so many requests to speak and be involved at events, both in Australia and overseas, that we couldn't keep up. And I was actually saying, how do we share the love with a whole lot of other people, and getting people like Nuffield scholars to be involved. So I think that was a key lesson that we looked at, and making sure we could share what I was hearing and seeing domestically with our industries. One of the key lessons, I think, was there's no one size fits all. And even though I knew this as a farmer, what really became clear is when we looked at the prescriptive and ideological approaches that were influencing global rules and standards, the way people farm in the EU is very different to the way we farm here. The way I farm is very different to how you farm in WA, because production systems are different, environments are different, soil is different, access to water is different. So it's really important that we can take a principles and outcomes-based approach, and that we really can think about those place-based solutions, because there's nothing more powerful than examples that we can give on the ground. The other thing, and I mentioned that sustainability was starting to become a really key theme for me wherever I went, and it's just got more and more important. But we need to remember that sustainability doesn't mean the same thing to all people. Sustainability can mean emissions reduction. Sustainability can mean resilience. Or, as I saw very clearly in visits to Southeast Asia and the Pacific recently, sustainability can mean food security and just being able to take people from poverty to subsistence. So we need to actually think how we frame sustainability. Repurposing of subsidies is something that the Australian government is actually being quite strong on, and certainly through the WTO. And I think I saw a nuance around that. A lot of countries do subsidise agriculture, but if you are to say stop subsidising, the conversation stops. But if you can actually say, have you thought about repurposing those subsidies? Don't take the money out of agriculture, keep it in agriculture, but maybe put it towards research and development. That then allows me to talk about the wonderful model we have here in Australia, our Research and Development Corporation model. And I talked in the UK about that because they're transitioning away from subsidies. And I've said, put the money into R&D. But also, we can actually repurpose for better environmental outcomes, and particularly pertinent, once again, for developing countries and in our close neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we can repurpose for better health outcomes. And that's something that's resonated. And when I was in Indonesia recently, I was told they will never consider doing anything to their subsidies. But I raised this at a sustainability workshop I was at. I said, can we consider doing this? And someone spoke after me from the Indonesian government, and they said, you know, it's something we may be able to think about. I then went to speak to one of the farming organisations. I was told, don't raise it because no one's ever going to consider it. So I was a bit gentle, but I asked the question. And they said, you know what? We've actually been doing some work behind the scenes around this. So I said, well, go and talk to the government. So I think, you know, if you can chip away at these things, and sometimes I say it's about nudging policy, not just domestically, but globally, that we can actually start making those game changers. Innovation and productivity will continue to be absolutely key to how Australian agriculture can actually maintain its edge. But when you talk to farmers, you've got to talk to them about profitability, and this is something that is relevant all around the world. How much more money can you put in our pockets? So really talking about that value proposition to farmers is absolutely key and something we need to keep front of mind. The one thing that I think that I hadn't anticipated coming into this role was the absolute importance of relationships, soft power and diplomacy. That is absolutely key. Post-COVID, when it comes to trade and market access, don't think we can do this all over a laptop. You need to be there. And even though my role has still been a fly in, fly out, because of the actual title, I've been able to open doors for people on the ground, for our agricultural counsellors, for people in Austrade, for our ambassadors and other people in DFAT. So I think that's been very important. And if there's one thing I've learnt, it's that uncertainty is a given. And we've got to embrace change, and we've got to be nimble and responsive and diversified. So going forward, I think there's enormous opportunities for Australian agriculture. We do so many things so well here, and yet sometimes I think it's just become the way we farm. We've been farming sustainably for decades, and it's become embedded, and we take it for granted. We are world leading in soil health and the work we do around our soil strategy, so much so that Canada has actually picked up our national soil strategy and developed one for themselves. What we do around waste is actually world leading. Traceability, what we do around traceability is world leading. And of course, traceability with our biosecurity system underpins food safety. And it's food safety that actually does give us an edge into many of the markets that we are seeking to either enter or increase our exposure. For those who think that we can start to walk away from things such as net zero targets, I think one thing I would say, and I'd have to say these are my personal reflections coming from the last 3.5 years, what signal does that send to the rest of the world if we are start to walk back? But more importantly, the corporate sector has moved on, and particularly the finance sector. The finance sector drove ESG, and the finance sector is now driving what we're looking at around climate and nature. We already have climate-related financial disclosures that are mandatory for the biggest corporates and for those agribusinesses that are in the supply chain. Farmers will need to actually report what they're doing and what they're doing around emissions. But that's not the only thing. We have a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. So when it comes to nature positive and nature-based solutions, there's already a movement around the world that's moving towards this. And in relation to net zero targets, around 70% of our trading partners have these targets. So we've actually got to be mindful of that if we're thinking about doing anything in relation to that. On nature positive and nature-based solutions, we are also world leading in natural capital accounting. And this is something that I've watched for quite some time now. And the reason I like this work is because it provides the value proposition to farmers. It quantifies what is the value of the biodiversity, your soil health, the trees you plant, the water quality. It quantifies that and it actually demonstrates to a farmer why it's worth doing. And when I talked about profitability, if you can bring farmers with you, demonstrate that value proposition, they will go out and lead with this. And quite often, in fact most of the time, it's the private sector that's way out in front. And for government, it's to provide that framework and the guardrails and allow industry to go forth and deliver. When it comes to government policy, I think I was part of the agriculture and land sector plans and some of the consultation around that last year. That of course underpins the work we're doing around net zero and the 6 sectoral plans for decarbonisation. That was a wonderful experience in terms of co-design, where all of the stakeholders were being brought together and there was a genuine consultative discussion around what will work, what won't, ideas being put on the table and allowing them to be worked through. And I think the co-design principles are something that are very, very important. The government has announced a food security strategy. For me, food security is absolutely critical. Food security underpins national security. And we need to make sure that we talk about food. I'm very conscious that in my role I represent agriculture, fisheries and forestry. But food is a hook that everyone understands. As Gabby said, everyone's got to eat. And so we have seemed to have lost that connection between the broader community and the importance of agriculture, farmers and food. And I would hope that this will be a way that we actually can get a focus onto this. I think the thing we need to do is get on with it. We don't have time to wait, particularly when you look at conflict all around the world and don't think it can't come to our region. The other opportunity we have, and once again I've been in a very fortunate position to be an ACR Commissioner, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. This is a hidden gem for Australia. It's a way of thinking globally. How do you actually influence outcomes globally, and particularly around things like sustainability and climate? And the reason it's so good is it's about partnerships in country, and it's about capacity building, so that remains in the country. So one of the things I've been saying to the private sector and to our corporates is think about partnering with ACR in country, because it is about relationships. And if you partner with ACR, then you're going to be able to build those relationships and importantly build the trust that will then help to open doors in the future for trade and market access. And I think in this respect we've also got to remember that in agriculture we don't just trade in goods, we actually can trade in services. And the smarts we have here in Australian agriculture around agri-tech, biologicals, precision agriculture are so needed in some of these countries, and particularly in Southeast Asia, which has the growing middle class and where we are so well positioned to be able to open up new markets or grow the markets we have. Anyone who's heard me speak knows that I always talk about the Australian Sustainability Framework for Agriculture. It is a wonderful framework. We are the only country in the world that has an overarching articulation of sustainability. There are 17 principles. They talk to the ESGs, which are the language of the corporates. They also talk to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the language globally. Importantly though, what sits beneath this overarching framework are individual industry sustainability frameworks, which are fit for purpose for the different industries. So as a beef cattle producer, I refer to the beef sustainability framework. And there are calculators and there are tools and there are workshops I can go to that help me understand what I need to measure and what I'm going to need to be doing in the future. So it's really a great framework that works on a number of different levels. We are going to have to demonstrate our claims to sustainability, and that's going to mean we're going to need data and we're going to need other information and we're going to need to report this, particularly under things like the climate-related financial disclosures and what may come from nature-related. So I think it's important that we do think where data can exist, because we need to be careful about compliance burden and not increasing red tape. So are we able to look at data sets that may exist around Australia that we can actually provide a baseline back to farmers, and that's their starting point. And if we could do that, it then means any farmers that are doing additional things in this space could get rewarded, either through the market or maybe through another mechanism. I actually had the opportunity yesterday to go to the CSIRO and I saw their National Soils Archive and their soils, the National Soils Database. That's got a wealth of information. You know, could this not be a data set that fits under soil health under the Australian Sustainability Framework? And I think there is another opportunity that we've got. I don't know if we will hear next week, but some of you may be aware that Australia has made a joint bid with the Pacific for COP31. If we do get that, wouldn't it be a marvellous opportunity to showcase Australian agriculture and all the great things that we are doing? Hopefully we'll hear next week, because if we don't, it might not be till the end of the year and then we're scrambling to try and get ready. But I have been saying to all of the industries, think about this, get ready for it, because it's a marvellous opportunity. Thank you for coming and thank you for listening. There's so much more I could tell you about, but as I said, it's been an absolute privilege to be in this role, and I look forward to some questions now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue. That was amazing. Just let me clear up. So, why do you think you're not being replaced if this has been such a success? And who will do the role that you have been doing? Is there the infrastructure, agricultural counsellors or in-country experts who will do it?
So I'll answer that in two parts. The answer to your first question is I can't answer that because I don't know. My contract ends on 30 June this year. I had perhaps hoped I might be able to pass the baton on to the next person. And look, I hope that sometime in the future that there will be seen to be value in this role and that someone else will come into it. I do know that for quite often this role has been taught as being the best gig in the country, and there's a long queue of people who would love to do it. I think the second part of your question is, it's absolutely true. We have a fantastic network of agricultural counsellors. We have industry, our RDCs will have people in country such as Meat Livestock Australia. We have Austrade people in country and we have DFAT people in country. I think the thing that this role has been different about is it provides that farmer and industry voice in fora that industry quite often does not get access to. And I think that will be the missing link if the role was not to continue. And I'm not sure how you replicate that.
And so the obvious follow-up question then is, why is ag special? Because other industries don't get a similar type role.
I think when you look at some ambassadors, for example, there's an ambassador for climate change. There are a number of different ambassador roles that exist in the DFAT portfolio. And I'm biased, but of course I would say, of course, ag is special. We all need to eat. Food security is critical. If we don't have agriculture, how is Australia going to continue to prosper? 70% of our agricultural produce goes overseas as exports. What does this mean if we don't actually have a focus on agriculture? So I'd say it's really important that we can maintain that voice, and particularly in an environment that's so challenged now. We had COVID, conflict just continues. It just doesn't seem to be abating. Cost of living, we could well see supply chain concerns that we saw during COVID and that we saw with the Ukraine war. We need to make sure that we are not just food secure here, but that our trading partners and the ones that we actually have in terms of our near neighbours, Southeast Asia and definitely the Pacific, continue to be food secure.
Thank you very much. Our first question from Working Press is Kath Sullivan from Landline.
Thanks, Gabby, and thank you, Sue. It's Kath from the ABC. You mentioned your role in part is about advocacy. Are you suggesting that farm advocacy in this country is broken at the moment?
That's a loaded question, Kat. And I've been involved in farm advocacy for a long time. I mean, I worked at the National Farmers Federation. I think the difference in my role, and advocacy is there because you've actually got to advocate for your constituency. I don't have a constituency. My biggest challenge is being advocating for all of Australian agriculture, fisheries and forestry, when it is really hard to be across the detail in all of those areas. So for me, it's been working very closely with the different industry bodies, the peak bodies, the RDCs, some of the NGOs and others, to really get a partnership there. So one, I can learn what they're doing, so I can share that and I can amplify the voice of what they're doing, but also to feed them back and connect them with other people so that when you get down to that level of detail, the people that are talking to me about it, maybe in another country, are connected to the right person. So I think advocacy needs to be done on a number of different levels, and You know, there is no single silver bullet to any of this. It needs to be a suite of tools, and we've got to constantly say, what tool are we pulling at any particular time, and we've also got to remember that there will be trade-offs.
But you use the example of the sheep and the trading negotiators in Scotland, I think you said, who didn't know the difference between Australia's wool and meat production, which for you was a pretty basic thing to explain. What's going on that message hadn't got to the Australian trade negotiators to explain that to the other people at the table?
I think when you think of the way that trade deals are negotiated, it is government to government. And yes, you can advocate, but how much information do you provide about very complex areas, unless you actually know that question may come up? And if that question does come up, then you are actually relying on people in the room to go back to industry and say, can you provide me with an example here? It's always going to be challenging, and I have to say that 12 months after I was in the UK, I actually presented the Queensland Rural Press Club, and the message I gave to industry was, you need to think about mulesing. I'm not here to tell you what to do, you make your own business decision. But certainly what I'm hearing coming from the EU is that they are not going to they're not going to look favourably on mulesing practices. Now, I copped a lot of flack for saying that, but in my role, I could say it. A peak body would have been challenged to say that because they're talking to their own constituency. So sometimes I think in my role, I have to poke the bear, and sometimes you just have to wear what it is, and it is a judgment call. Because sometimes I very much wear a government hat, and at other times I wear a farmer hat, and other times I'm somewhere in the middle.
Okay, next question from Ben Westcott from Bloomberg.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you so much for your speech, Sue. It is interesting that you're not being replaced at a time, particularly when Australia is facing so much pressure on its agricultural exports from a certain US president and a variety of other angles. What are you hearing from farmers around that 10% impost on Australian beef to the US, and what have you told the government in terms of how that has been received by the Australian agricultural community?
Look, the US is very interesting, you know, because when we started to see some of these announcements that were coming out and the positioning, I think I probably had the same personal reaction that many people had. But you sit back and you look at what happened to Canada, what happened to Mexico, and the position we've taken, which is, let's step back and wait and see. We have a very good relationship with the US, and this does come down to relationships, and there need to be further conversations, I think is the way we have to do it, because there is so much uncertainty around this. If you were to try and push back, what will be the consequences? I think one of the things I've been particularly watching has been the response of perhaps other countries in relation to this. I mean, for Australia, you could almost say 10% is the new zero. But for some of our trading partners in Southeast Asia, it's been a lot higher. So how will they respond? And what happens, say, if something happens between China and the US? Do we then end up with a lot more competition for some of those markets? So I do think it's a wait and see, and I do think it's something that we've just got to keep a really careful eye on. And the world of diplomacy and trade and market access just gets trickier and trickier.
Do you think there is potentially more risk and more concern in the community around a rushed approach, potentially trading in some biosecurity laws or bringing in more US beef than there is just from those 10% tariffs?
Look, I think the more well-versed people in this area would be aware of that, but I'd say most people don't even know that in relation to beef, there are issues around biosecurity. And I think one thing we've got to remember is we are an island nation. Biosecurity is critically important to us. And a lot of the work we do actually that is of value is not just within our borders, it's not just in our country. A lot of work actually gets done in other countries and helping them. And Australia actually does this in country. And that actually helps to prevent the disease or another incursion coming. So it's really important in terms of those relationships that we think about that. The average person out there in the street doesn't necessarily know that. And sometimes we've got to think about how we can communicate what can be a very complex set of decisions into a message that can resonate.
Thanks. Our next question is from Julie Hare at the AFR.
Hi Sue, thanks for your speech. I'm just wondering whether over the last few years you've got any clearer idea or you can see the future of agriculture any more clearly, particularly in Australia, given the rising challenges around environment, social changes, those sorts of things. And just attached to that, where the role of the family farm sits compared to corporate agriculture and where the workforce comes from. Sorry, there was a lot in there.
Oh. There was. So the first part of your question, I would say, over the last 3.5 years in this role, I've become more optimistic, not less. And that's because I've become more educated and aware of what we're doing in Australia and what other countries are doing around the world. I think the challenge is always going to be about where the standards are made and what influences them. But I think we've just got to keep a multi-pronged approach in relation to that. In certain industry sectors, there has been a move away from family farms into more corporate, largely driven actually by technology, capital investment, size of land to become viable. And I think that's just something that will happen. That's not to say that some of those corporates are not actually family corporates, and that's what we've seen in some industry sectors. I think once again, going back to that no one size fits all, it depends on the industry, it depends on the area you are. What is fit for purpose? Is it going to be a corporate type of approach or is it going to be a family farm approach? I'm very conscious that in Australia, I am very small in terms of farm size. I go to some other countries and, being in Malaysia, Philippines and Indonesia recently where their average farm size is 2 hectares and they think my place is enormous. And yet they are family farms, they're smallholder farms. And so I think we've got to think about that. We've also got to think about the role of mechanisms such as cooperatives and how they actually can bring people together to get purchasing power and just greater market access. And your final question was around workforce.
Workforce, yeah.
Workforce is challenging all around the world. It's hugely challenging for us. When I was on the COVID Commission, the workforce dilemmas were huge because we were actually seeing whole farms just trashing the produce they had because the backpackers had left. We couldn't get access to labour and farmers couldn't do anything but trash their produce. So one of the things that I worked on as part of the COVID Commission was really giving access to labour through the Pacific Worker Scheme to make sure that we could actually have people come in. I think it's really important that we think about workforce. Once again, I was at CSIRO yesterday. I think all of the postgrad or postdoc students we saw came from overseas. So I asked the question, the implications of not being able to get international students. And they said, well, one part is for the universities, but the next challenge is the pipeline that we have coming into organisations like CSIRO. So I think workforce dilemmas will continue. As a farmer myself, I know it's really rewarding, but it still is hard, physical, dirty work. It's not always something that perhaps a lot of farmers want to do. But on the other hand, there's a lot of young farmers I know that are passionate about farming and they can't get into it because of the cost of entry is just huge. So I think it's quite a complex dilemma, and having also had an involvement in the aged care sector that also had huge workforce challenges, we need a huge amount of workforce to come in to help with our aged care sector, our disability sector, our agricultural sector, our retail sector, our building sector, and we're not getting it from within.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is Peter Hobson from Reuters.
Hi Sue, thanks for your speech. I wanted to follow up on Ben's question about biosecurity. So the Americans clearly are not happy with our biosecurity rules and see it as an unfair trade barrier. To what extent are Australia's biosecurity rules a point of friction with our trade partners? And are we getting those policies right?
I probably can't comment on whether we're getting the policies right. What I can say, and as I said earlier, we are an island nation and it is critically important that we do protect what we have. And our biosecurity rules are absolutely vital to underpinning what we say around being able to produce safe food. And we don't want to see that threatened. Yes, there are other countries that would say that our biosecurity rules form the basis of what they would say non-tariff barriers. There are a lot of non-tariff barriers around the world. This is an area that you continue to have to discuss and negotiate as part of free trade agreements or part of the broader rules-based system when we're looking at standards. I think what has been said here in Australia about not compromising our biosecurity or our national interest is critically important, because I think that's what we have to protect first, and then we have to look at how we can get access for our industries.
So, but how upset are our trade partners with this? Is this just a sort of thing that they sort of raise and then they're reassured and then they move on, or is it actually a really, really big deal? It's
not something that gets raised with me in my role, because free trade agreements is something that the DFAT portfolio gets involved with, and it's something I've been particularly careful about when I'm in country, is I try not to get pulled into bilaterals and any discussion about it. And you know, even though I'm a ministerial appointment, I'm not a government employee, and I think that's actually been to my advantage, because I don't get to see anything, which means I can't accidentally let anything out. So when it comes to those negotiations, I can't comment, but in my role as Special Representative, no one has actually raised the issue of biosecurity with me. When I was in the US, I was aware about their naturalisation rules in relation to US bred beef compared to beef or cattle, compared to cattle coming from Canada or Mexico. But that was the only time I've probably had that issue raised.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Next question, Tim Lester from the Rural Press Club.
Thank you, Sue. Also here representing the Australian Council of Agricultural Journalists. I'll just start saying I agree with your position that food security is the hook. It is how we get into it. But a big shout out for fibre security as well, because they do go hand in hand, and without the fibres, we'd not only be hungry, we'd be naked and cold. So they are part of that story. There was to follow the fibre, there was a thread I think I picked up, which is around partnerships and the importance of partnerships. And I think we see that in the RDCs, and I was going to say, having had the privilege of following you as part of my own career into a role, I'm hoping to do it again, I'm putting my hand up. The RDCs are an amazing partnership. The ACR piece is an amazing partnership. Even in our advocacy, there are really important partnerships here. I'm wondering, are you seeing partnerships that either aren't in place or are at risk of falling away?
Thank you, and maybe I'll start by saying I absolutely support what you say around fibre. If you'd seen me at 7 o'clock this morning with a beanie and 6 layers of clothes on, I couldn't have done without the fibre. Partnerships are critically important. And I've been banging on for quite some time about collaboration being the absolute key. It's the power of the collective that is really going to get us a long way. I see a huge opportunity for partnerships, particularly in the area of climate financing, in the area of certainly what we're seeing around nature-based and nature-positive solution, natural capital accounting. There are a lot of corporates wanting to put money into this, and it's not just from a social licence perspective. They're actually saying we need to do this because we can see what's coming in the future, and we need to make sure we set ourselves up for this. So that's why I'm saying to corporates, you know, think about partnerships with ACR, but think about partnerships with others that are doing work in this area, because it's really going to be a really great way to go. I can't think of partnerships that I haven't seen fail, so I'll make a more broader comment. I think partnerships have to be genuine. You've got to think about what is the outcome you want to achieve for the partnership. And what you've got to be careful of is the I coming into it. So the ego part that says, I want to be recognised for my part in this, not this is a genuine partnership and we're trying to get an outcome and this isn't about me.
Thank you.
Okay, next question from Corrie McLeod, Innovation Australia.
Thank you so much for your address. I had a question about traceability, but in regards to provenance and the ability to, say, charge a premium. You mentioned profitability for farmers as being key. You know, we're Asia's food bowl. We've been talking for a long time about how you prove traceability. We've talked about blockchain and lots of different ways. Are the agriculture community at large really attuned to how to be able to demonstrate provenance and commanding a premium? How is that, you know, injecting a boost of premium into the agriculture economy? I
think we see quite a lot of farmers doing this themselves. That, you know, their branding and their marketing for their own particular brand. We see it in dairy, we see it in meat, we see it in wine, we see it in pork. Traceability. I'm most familiar with the beef traceability. So where you put electronic ear tags into the ears and you can basically track paddock to plate. So if there is an incursion, you're not shutting down the whole country, you're actually knowing where you can go for anything that may happen. And, you know, you get testing that's done around residues and you can trace it back to where that might come from. What underpins that is very much a commitment to food safety from the producer, and it really is up to a producer or sometimes a collective that will actually say, we will actually build on the provenance of this. Provenance is an interesting one because it really does go to your ability to brand and market, and in the end someone's got to pay for it. And once it gets past niche, the question is, will a premium remain or will it get baked in? And I think what we see with sustainability is it is going to get baked in. It is just going to be expected. It is expected that we in Australia produce safe, clean, healthy food and sustainable fibre. I got the fibre in for you, Tim. So that's taken for granted. But maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, people could have got a premium for selling that. So I think we've got to continue to think about what is going to be our marketing edge. I think healthy competition is great, but one thing I've said globally, we've got to play as Team Australia because other countries trade with us as a country. Yes, there will always be trade-offs when we look at negotiating agreements, but in the end, we've got to think about what's the best for the country. And I think, once again, coming back to that earlier question about what's in the national interest is really important. So I perhaps haven't answered your question because I think provenance comes down to, is it something that's going to give you a brand and market edge? Is it something that's going to work for everyone in every industry? Maybe or maybe not. And I think the industries will actually work out where they need to focus on it.
Thank you.
Okay, next question to Nick Stewart from Ability News, and then I have two questions from rural journalists, unfortunately elsewhere, i.e. in rural areas.
Thanks very much for your speech. I report on disability issues. You have focused on the rural needs of Australia. When you were a COVID commissioner, you obviously understood there is particular differences in rural areas that can't be extrapolated elsewhere. The NDIS has NDIA has last week introduced straight across the board restrictions on the amount of money that's being paid for therapy services and other things like that. I was wondering how much is the fact that we have not got your immediate replacement in the wings. How much of this is a problem of Australia as capital cities just not listening to, not looking at the countryside, not actually engaging with the particular needs of people in rural areas?
Look, I think that is, for me it's a fact. And I do bemoan the fact that we get this growing divide. And it's not just between the city and the country, because even people in rural and regional areas, kids don't always know where their food comes from. And when I hear stories that kids think their food comes from supermarkets, or kindergarten kids say, I don't want to eat beef because it's bad for the environment, or I don't want to eat chocolate because of the orangutans. I think we've really got to find a way to get the facts out and dispel myths, which in an area social media is really, really hard. I used to work at the Regional Australia Institute, and we did a lot of work around rural communities and thriving and resilient rural communities, and what some of the challenges were in those communities. And it was access to services, access to infrastructure, access to connectivity and communications, and access to workforce. And they are probably really the key things. And a lot of work has been done around Australia in trying to create some of those thriving communities. And it's really hard. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. Do you build it and they will come? Or do you build it and that's a lot of money that's gone? And let me contrast perhaps what they've done around Karratha with the Ord. And we are a very, very, very big country with a very small population, and infrastructure costs an awful lot of money. And so it's a really tricky balance with how do you get some of these services out to those that need them in these communities. Technology has helped. Certainly things like telehealth have really made a big difference to be able to get those services. Education now is online. One of the key challenges has been connectivity. But once again, we've made big changes there. I think it's an ongoing challenge, and it's for me that something that I say wherever I speak, we all need to be part of this to try and help to bridge the gap.
So the vital thing is to share knowledge, or to use another word, journalism.
Journalism, I think it's part of all of us. The more we can talk, we can share what we do, we can share that knowledge, we can tell the story, and I think we need to get much, much better at telling our story.
Thank you. A question from Pip Courtney at ABC's Landline. The EU is implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism known as the CBAM, which will impose carbon pricing on certain imported goods starting in 2026. Is it a trade barrier under a different name, and are Australian farm exporters ready for it or even aware that it's coming? And then as a follow-up, in the future, will AusAg exports have carbon passports listing their carbon intensity, or if it's carbon positive, neutral or negative?
Look, I think, and I'll bring those two questions together, because I think that there are certainly people looking at what are the implications to CBAM, what it means here. Of course, in Australia, we do have our ACCU, so Australian Carbon Credit Units, so we have a market mechanism here. There's been a lot of work being done around carbon measurements, storage, sequestration, what that means for farmers. I think the challenge that comes is, how do you get a global recognition of what fits under trade and market access rules? And that's an ongoing dilemma in a whole lot of these areas, and a challenge we're really finding under sustainability is, if the EU does go down the path of saying we need you to prove what you're doing around carbon, is what we are doing here going to be recognised? And I think that's why the work that certainly the government does globally in engaging with these global rules and standard setting bodies is critically important, because that's where it helps to actually say and demonstrate what we need to accept. I think we need to continue to really focus on an outcomes and principles based approach, because it's very hard if you're just existing in a prescriptive approach. But I think and if I give you an example of perhaps where some of that pressure has had a good result, and that's been in the deforestation regulations that have come from the EU, that were really hard-hitting. Australia's now been assessed as being low risk. There still are implications. I don't think industry fully recognises that the implications of EUDR flow through to something that might not directly be exported. And indeed, when I was in Southeast Asia at the Sustainability Workshop, you know, I had a couple of countries who say, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. So I don't think it's something that's unique to us. I think it's something we've got to continue to monitor and work for. Industry will continue to do that in terms of its advocacy, but I think the work that government's doing in relation to those global standard setting bodies is critically important as well.
Okay. And Terry Crowley from R.M. Williams Publishing. Now that formal drought declarations are a thing of the past, how do we ensure that agricultural regions get the support they need in the changing climate?
So I tend to look at drought, climate, floods through a risk lens. I was asked the question recently. I presented to the Argentine Congress, and someone said to me, how do you respond to the climate deniers? And I said, I don't talk about climate, I talk about risk. As farmers, we have to deal with the weather day in, day out. That dictates a lot of what we do. And the reality is we know we're facing more fires, floods, droughts and events like this. And it needs to come down to risk mitigation, preparedness, diversification. And I think that's what we need to continue to do around support. And if I go back 25 years when I was at the National Farmers Federation, even then when we had drought support, we were talking about how do we prepare farmers so that we actually can get them to invest in hay sheds, silage pits and things like that, so that they're actually prepared for it. So that when you get to an event, whether it's a drought, a fire or flood, you at least perhaps can be better prepared. Droughts, probably easier to prepare than fire and flood, simply because of its intensity and its timing and when it can happen. But I think the reality is we're not the only country that is facing tightened budgets. So we've actually got to look at ways that support may come, and I think support needs to be in preparedness.
And a last question from Morris Riley. Better squeeze the boss in.
I'm glad you mentioned the Regional Institute of Australia. As you know, Liz Ritchie is a passionate advocate. There's no such thing as a short conversation with her. But she does raise, you know, we're talking about skills, attracting labour to the regions, rural Australia, not just attracting labour for farming. You know, it's doctors, it's teachers, it's nurses, it's you know, the whole it's societies, things. So in your travels around this country, what do you think it's going to take to attract a broad range of skills to want to go and live in regional Australia? This is your chance to boost the regional Australia, how good it is. You know, what do we need to do? And I just think, you know, we've all got labour shortages, certainly even before COVID. So, you know, what's the answer? Is it immigration?
I don't think there's a single answer. I think it's got to be a whole range of different responses. Immigration is one, and being able to get more people to come into the country, and whether it's permanent immigration or whether it's temporary visas, I think we need to look at that. We need to make sure we've got the access to services in those regional communities, because if people are going to move there, they want to know that they can get somewhere to live, that they can get somewhere for their kids to go to school, that if their kids are sick, that there is access to medical services. So the access to services is really critical. During COVID, we saw a bit of a movement out to regional areas, and I know, having to work from the farm, the biggest challenge was around connectivity, and it wasn't that long ago that if you lived out of a capital city, you only had a limited amount of data on the satellite, and then you were what was called shaped. So you'd run out basically for the rest of the month. That changed during COVID. All of a sudden we'd been told that the satellite doesn't have the capacity, but it did. So I think there are different ways to actually get the outcomes we want. We don't always want to wait for a crisis or that burning platform. What we want to be thinking about doing is, what is the scenario that can happen? And this could turn into a crisis. So how do we start prepare for it? For regional Australia, and look, and I'm a passionate advocate for agriculture and regional Australia, we need those vibrant rural communities for resilience around Australia. So I think the different ways we can think to get people not just out there, but staying out there is important, and I'm one of them.
We've got time for one more question. Kath Sullivan from the ABC.
It's just a yes or a no one, Sue.
Well done.
Challenge to you anyway. Do you think that if Australia is to have a special representative on agriculture after your time, that they need to be a farmer, or can people who don't farm also represent Australian agriculture?
So the answer is no. That's the short answer. The reason for my answer is that I was the first person in this role, and we were making the role up. We knew what the objectives were. I come from a policy background. I know early in the piece people were saying, we're not here to do policy, but I could never help myself getting involved. So I've brought a certain perspective to the role because of my background, my experience and expertise. Yes, being a farmer and being able to give those absolute on-the-ground examples have been really useful, but I can't give all the examples for all of the industry sectors around the country. So I'm very much dependent on liaising with industry itself. So someone who comes into the role who's not a farmer may well bring other experience and expertise that would be absolutely critical and valuable for the role. And for them, it's being able to have a good network of people in the industry that can feed them those practical examples.
Thank you very much. Please thank Sue McCluskey. Careful of the step. Careful of the